Chapter 6, Observation. Purposes of observation. Observation is much more than looking at what a child does. Observation is the most direct way of becoming familiar with the learning and development of the child. Observation is paying attention to the unique behaviors of a child, recording them and assessing them. Observation allows the teacher to focus the behaviors of the child, which also allows the teacher to see the child as a unique individual and not just as another member of a large group. Observation can be used in a couple of major ways: understanding a child's behavior, evaluating their development, and evaluating their learning process. Evaluating child development. By observing children, we can learn about 5 of their attributes: their interests and preferences, their levels of social and cognitive development, their strategies for creating desired effects, their skills and achievements, and their personalities and temperaments. We can record these developments by recording them as descriptions of actions, quotations of language, descriptions of gestures, and descriptions of creations. The child's developmental stages are split into 5. These 5 are pre-production, early production, speech emergence, intermediate language proficiency, advanced language proficiency. Understanding child behavior. Observing young students in their daily activities is a more accurate way of evaluating them compared to assessments because they are not yet fully developed mentally and cannot show their knowledge through standardized testing. Children also cannot express themselves through language, so the best way to understand their behavior is through observing. A child's physical actions reveal just as much about them as their mental capabilities and what they say when they communicate. Human beings are social creatures, and by observing young children and their behaviors, we are able to understand how social development and behaviors are progressing. Role of the observer. What does the observer actually do? Becoming a skilled observer takes practice. Learning to pay attention, seeing what there is to see, hearing what there is to hear. Writing descriptively, being thorough, and knowing one's own strengths and limitations and personal perspective to avoid reporting bias. The student, teacher, or researcher visits a classroom or other place where a group of children may be observed as they engage in routine activities. Variables predetermined by the observer are purpose and objectives for the observation, the time spent studying the child, and the form in which the observation will be conducted and recorded. The observer sits on the side or in an observation booth and watches children. Observations must be well planned and timed so as not to interfere with learning activities. A teacher routinely observes children in his or her classroom to determine the right level activities for them. Much like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, the teacher is scaffolding the learning based on where the child is at and what level we want to get the child to. Is each child engaged? Is she bored? Is he frustrated? Becoming a skilled observer takes time. It's something that we improve as we practice. So step 1, begin by watching the children's actions. Step 2, observe everything that is going on in your classroom. 3, begin to focus on smaller groups of children. 4, begin to focus on individual children in the group. 5, focus on one child in the group. And 6, focus on the child's emotions and expressions. Observations help you read children and situations. Types of observations. The types of observations used include anecdotal records, running records, specimen records, time sampling, event sampling, and checklist and rating scales. Anecdotal record is a written description of a child's behavior. It is an objective account of an incident that tells what happened, when, and where. It may be used to understand some aspect of behavior. An advantage is that it's quick and easy. The disadvantage is that it's not enough information or detail. We often do them very quickly. Running records is a more detailed narrative of a child's behavior that includes a sequence of events, includes everything that occurred over a period of time, all behavior observed rather than the one incident used in the anecdotal. Advantages: more information than an anecdotal, and related staff and service members can use information to better understand the child. The disadvantage is that the observation must be scheduled and time designated for this purpose. A specimen record is similar to a running record, but instead focuses on one area of development, as well as is usually recorded by an outside observer. Here's an example of an anecdotal record. My apologies, it's blurry, but the anecdotal, say you were doing a reading lesson, and so you sat there with your chart and you observed 9 students, and you would just jot down the notes very quickly as each student participated and engaged in the activity. Types of observations continued is time sampling. The purpose of time sampling is to record the frequency of behavior for a designated period of time. The observer decides ahead of time what behaviors will be observed, what the time interval will be, and how the behaviors will be recorded. After a number of samplings are completed, the observer reviews the data to determine why a behavior is occurring. Useful with young children because their observable behaviors are brief. Advantages are it's very clear. A teacher wants to see when and how often a behavior occurs. The disadvantage, the time for the observation may be difficult to manage on a regular basis. Event sampling, used when behavior occurs in a particular setting. Behaviors may be infrequent or odd times. Event sampling is used to determine causes and results. Bell and Low in 1977 used the ABC analysis. A is the antecedent, B is the target behavior, C is the consequent behavior. Advantages, focus on a purpose, find out why a child uses a particular behavior. Disadvantage, target behavior, hard to anticipate, and time spent observing behavior can be used for another purpose. An example of time sampling and event sampling, let me just go to the next slide. Here you go, here's your ABCs. So very much when my students, if there is a fight or something happens, I tell them, don't give me paperwork. I don't want more paperwork to do because you automatically have to go. You have to write it up because you need to CYA, cover your you know what. So the A is the activity, the event, what happened before, what was leading up to the event, to the occurrence of the behavior. The behavior is what actually happened, what was the interval, what was the frequency, how bad was it? And the consequence was what happened immediately after the occurrence of the incident. Checklists and rating scales. A checklist is a list of sequential behaviors arranged in a system of categories. The observer can use the checklist to determine whether the child exhibits the behavior or skills listed. Rating scales are used to determine the degree to which the child exhibits a certain behavior or the quality of the behavior. Each trait is rated on a continuum. A lot of times we use these as rubrics to see if a child completed all the steps of a project that we're asking them to complete. And right, sometimes they could be from 1 to 4 or how frequently. So that's that example. Observing development. Young children develop rapidly. Development is continuous and sequential and involves change over time. In part, as the process of change in an individual ages, not all children develop at same stage of level. Chronological age, rate of maturity, individual experience. Developmental change. Quantitative physical growth and cumulative. Qualitative developmental change. Change is psychological characteristics, speech, emotions, and intelligence. Development is characterized as continuous. Quantitative, continually adding new skills and abilities. Qualitative, change incorporating new development with existing characteristics to create more sophisticated psychological traits. 4 domains of development. Physical preschool children, most important period of physical and motor development. Observation physical development. Cross motor skills involve the movements and abilities of the large muscle of the body in physical activities. Fine motor skills involves body's small muscles, specifically hands and fingers. Purpose for observing physical development, how children develop gross and fine motor skills, become familiar with the kinds of physical activities young children in as they practice the use of gross and fine motor skills, to become familiar with individuals' difference in physical development. Social and emotions are significant during the early years. Interaction, parents, siblings, caretakers, smiley, toddler, physical approach others, social interaction with others. Emotional development parallels and affects social development. preschool child action behaviors such emotion as happiness, angry, joy, jealous, and fear. Most common emotion in preschool children are aggression, dependency, and fear. Characteristics are self-concept, self-esteem, self-regulation of emotions. Purpose for observation, social and emotions. To learn how children develop social skills, to become familiar with how children learn about social interactions, to understand how children differ in social skills development, to become familiar with the way preschool children handle their emotions, to be aware of differences in children's emotional behaviors and responses. Cognitive development stems from mental functioning, how the child learns about and understands the world. Piaget, cognitive development in stages, thinking process, sensor motor skills, intellectual growth, improved memory, pre-operational stage, ages 2 through 6, language development, concrete operation, concepts and classification, conservation. Purpose for observation. Understand how children use their cognitive abilities to learn. Children very much construct their own learning. That's what Piaget thought. Understand the differences in children's cognitive style, to become familiar with how children develop the ability to use classification, seriation, and one-to-one correspondence. The ability to use classification, the example in the book that they gave was that the observer was watching the little girl sort and stack buttons, and when she realized that she was working on this one pile of buttons, she was sorting the buttons with 4 holes in them. So that's just an example of that. Understanding how children use play and interaction with materials to extend cognitive abilities, to become familiar with how children think and what they can learn, to evaluate what children has learned. Language development, purpose for observing major accomplishment, Purpose for observing major accomplishment during preschool and primary grade. Language is also related to cognitive development. Babies begin using speech as single utterance. Toddler and preschool expand their repertoire. Egocentric, child talks to himself or herself and does not use language to communicate to others. Rules of language, morphology and syntax, understanding the sounds and grammar of language. Semantic rules explain vocabulary and meaning development. Purpose for observation, to become aware of a child's ability to use language to communicate. Understand the difference between egocentric and socialized speech. To learn how the child uses syntax, grammar, and vocabulary in the process of expanding and refining his or her language. The difference in language development among individual children, particularly from homes where another language or dialect is spoken, how children are progressing in learning. To determine a child's dialect language in a bilingual, when placed in a bilingual program. Advantages and disadvantages of using observation for assessment. Observation is used to gather the kind of information that may not be available from structured methods of measurement. Advantages, routines children engage in are natural. Observer can focus on behavior or information needed and concentrates on specific behavior. Example, if the child is showing aggression, the observer can focus on aggression incidents to help the child use more appropriate behavior. Disadvantages, observer can miss detail that may impact the quality of the data gathered. The observer may focus on the wrong behaviors. The observer may become less attentive during observation period. Observer's bias can affect observer's interpretation of information obtained, can be misleading when the incident is taken out of context, resulting in the validity of the observation may be doubtful. Observation guidelines. Observation is valuable for many reasons, but it is usually the least used evaluation due to time constraints. Determining the observation site depends on type of observation being conducted, purpose of the observation, location of the observation, make arrangement with observation site to schedule the observation. Observer behaviors during the observation visit, share purpose with the classroom teacher being visited. Observer should conduct observation in a manner that is compatible with the teacher's style of leadership in the type of program being observed. Undergo a background check. Required to check in at main office when arriving at location. Since observer is a guest, an ID badge is required so other staff is aware of guests. Observer seats themselves in a position to draw attention. Observer dress in simple clothing of one color rather than bright garments to draw unnecessary attention, right? When a child knows that they're being observed, the students are very aware when there's an outsider in their classroom. They become protective of their environment. So when there's an outside observer coming in, you need to blend in with that environment and not stick out. Like in an FBA, a formal behavior assessment, the teacher and the students and the para are all in the classroom, and then usually the school psychologist comes in and conducts the observation. And you have to realize that the psychologist's observation is going to be biased based on her own thoughts of what she's predetermined, what she's expecting to see, but then what's going on in the environment and how the kids are reacting to her presence is actually going to change the outcome of the observation. Observation guidelines, continued. Ethics during the observation visit. The observer must be alert to proper way to use information gathered. Example of privacy of children, staff, and families, right? HIPAA laws, FERPA, we all know it. For children being observed, only the first name should be used. Confidential, safeguard from casual use by others. Child should not be discussed in an unprofessional manner, and child should be present when he or she is being discussed. Consent from family needed prior to observation. Aware of the ethics of the profession for teachers in training. It is the NAEYC Code of Ethical Conduct and Statement of Commitment serves as the progressional guide for ethical behavior. Avoiding personal bias and affect the observer's reaction to and report of an observation. Difference in value system can cause bias. Observers' reaction to the site can distort the observational data. Bias on the time of the observation or the briefness of the visit. And that's it. I guess I'll leave you with a quote from Walt Whitman. Be curious, not judgmental. Thanks. That's it for chapter 6.